Eleonora Vance thought she understood silence. For 30 years, it had been her only reliable friend on the Solitude Creek Ranch, a vast, empty quiet that symbolized a promise kept. The name Eleonora was buried with her father. She was just Nora now. Running the place had worn her hands down to something as cracked and weathered as the dry riverbed, but it had also granted her a measure of peace. This peace was built upon a single, unshakable rule. If you don't let anyone in, you can't be let down. Her entire life had become a monument to that rule, a fortress erected on the day her father made a promise he couldn't keep, and then vanished, swallowed by a different kind of silence that consumed her world. She believed that wound had been cauterized, the pain long since managed. She was so sure. But then, just as the sky was bruising to the deep purple that signals night's final victory, a man appeared at her gate. He wasn't scary, just tired. A man who looked as if he were stitched together from dust and regret, bearing a weariness that seemed to pull at the very air around him. He pushed a small, cold iron key into her palm. It was ornate, old, heavy with unspoken history. A debt of water and shadow must be paid, he whispered, his voice like sand skittering over stone. Before she could react, he was gone, dissolving back into the encroaching twilight as if he had been a mirage all along. Nora almost threw the key away, dismissing it as just another piece of desert junk. But there was something in the memory of his eyes, a sorrow so ancient and profound that she felt she knew it intimately. It was a sorrow that felt terrifyingly like her own. The key has been delivered. The debt must be paid. Subscribe now to witness Nora's world unravel and uncover the secrets of water and shadow. Don't miss a single clue. My gaze fell from Taza's steady eyes to the map spread across my porch rail. It was my land, yet it wasn't. The familiar contours of the hills, the winding path of the creek, the stand of old pines, they were all there but overlaid with names and symbols in a language I couldn't read. It felt like looking at a photograph of my own face with someone else's memories written across it. My hand, which had been clutching the wooden rail, slowly unclenched. A cold knot of disbelief and a strange, burgeoning curiosity tightened in my stomach. Taza didn't wait for me to speak. He didn't need to. His finger, weathered and strong, traced a line on the brittle parchment. Your great-grandmother, Eleanor Vance, was a woman who understood the spirit of this land, he began, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to calm the frantic beating of my heart. When she came here, she did not seek to conquer it. She sought to belong to it. A pact was made, not of land ownership as your papers would say, but of guardianship. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the valley that stretched out before us. This land was to be a sanctuary, a place of refuge for our people, should they ever need it, a promise sealed not with ink, but with honor. I stared at him, my mind racing. Eleanor Vance, the formidable woman in the sepia-toned photograph above the fireplace, a woman I knew only as a stern ancestor who had built this ranch from nothing. A sanctuary. The word echoed in my mind, mocking my own view of this place as my fortress, my escape. I looked past Taza, at the silent crowd, at the children holding their mothers' hands, their dark eyes wide with a quiet reverence. They weren't looking at me with hostility. They were looking at my home as if they were finally seeing it again after a long, long time. And in that moment, the old iron key I'd found, heavy and useless in my pocket, suddenly felt like it might unlock more than just a dusty attic. It might unlock the very story now being laid bare on my porch. Nora was discovering just how quickly her neighbors could turn on her. She had always kept the town of Redemption at a distance, a feeling that seemed entirely mutual. The moment word spread that she was talking to Taza and his people, Mayor Silas Croft was on the phone, his voice sharp with accusation. "What in God's name are you doing, Nora? You're entertaining thieves." Their families had been like oil and water for 100 years, and the mayor's smarmy, righteous certainty made her skin crawl as he painted her as a traitor to the town and its history. Just when she thought it couldn't get worse, her son, Leo, screeched into the driveway down from Phoenix, his face a mask of pure fury. "Are you crazy?" he spat, not even waiting for a hello. He accused her of giving away his inheritance, their legacy, for what he dismissed as a ghost story from strangers. Leo couldn't see it, of course. He couldn't see that his mother was already living in her own ghost story, haunted by a father who never came back. He just saw a stubborn old woman about to lose everything. Trapped between the town's hatred, her son's anger, and the quiet, unyielding presence of the Apache, Nora felt the walls closing in. That night she knew she had to open the strongbox. It was the only place left to look for an answer. The strongbox sat in his father's old study, like a metal coffin, and for 30 years it had refused to give up its secrets. He'd never had the key. But now, a cold, ornate piece of iron slid into the lock as if it was made for it. It turned with a soft click, and the heavy lid opened with a sigh of stale, ancient air. He half expected to find the deed to the ranch, something to prove this was all his, unequivocally, but there were no deeds, just a stack of brittle, yellowed letters bound in twine, and underneath them, a single document. It was beautifully inscribed, written in 2 languages, English and Apache. A treaty, a pact, it said, of shared stewardship for this land and its water. The signature at the bottom wasn't his father's, it was his grandfather's. Tucked inside the treaty was a small, folded note from the dusty man at the gate, an old family friend. The note explained he had been sworn to deliver the key only when the last person who knew the whole story had met their own definitive silence. This secret, this pact, was so much older than his own private sorrow, and the weight of it felt like it could crush him right there on the floor. The first light of dawn was spilling over the mesas when he left the ranch house, the old treaty feeling heavy and foreign in his hand. He walked with deliberate steps toward the edge of his property, where the thin smoke of a morning fire rose into the cool air. The Apache had made their camp there, a quiet, temporary presence on the land he considered his own. He didn't approach them with the fire of anger he had felt the day before. That certainty had been replaced by a gnawing confusion, a sense of a story missing its most crucial pages. There, by a small, crackling fire, he found Taza. The Apache leader sat with a serene stillness, his gaze directed eastward, watching the sunrise bleed colors across the vast sky. The rancher paused, the document a stark white rectangle against the landscape. He stepped forward and held it out, an offering without words. Taza's eyes shifted from the horizon to the paper and then to the rancher's face. He didn't register surprise, only a deep, knowing calm. He nodded slowly, a gesture that confirmed he had been anticipating this very moment. "The debt of water and shadow," Taza said, his voice a quiet murmur that seemed to blend with the sounds of the waking desert. "Your grandfather was an honorable man." He looked back toward the fire, as if seeing images in the flames. He understood that no one can own the water, just as no one can own a shadow. We can only be its keepers. As the sun climbed, casting long shadows that danced across the ground, Taza began to speak of the past. He shared stories his own grandfather had told him, painting vivid pictures of another time. He spoke of the rancher's grandfather, sitting right where they were now, sharing coffee from a tin cup, their conversation not of borders and ownership, but of a shared future where both their peoples could thrive together on this land. With every word, the rancher's world tilted on its axis, the man before him transformed. This was not an enemy who wanted to steal his home, a threat to his legacy. This was the keeper of a promise, the guardian of a sacred pact his own family had made and then forgotten. The weight of this revelation was immense. He turned and walked back toward the familiar silhouette of the ranch house, but nothing felt familiar anymore. It was as if the very ground had become fluid and uncertain beneath his feet. The truth, he now understood, wasn't the weapon he had thought he could wield for a final decisive victory. It was a bridge, ancient and weathered, spanning a chasm of history he never knew existed, and he was standing at its center, disoriented and lost, with no idea which side of it he was supposed to be on. Armed with what she believed to be the truth, she agreed to the town hall meeting, convinced that if she could only explain the situation and show them the treaty her grandfather had signed, the townspeople would understand. Silas Croft, however, had other plans. He allowed her to speak, letting her lay out the entire history of the pact of shared stewardship. When she finished, the room fell into a profound silence, and for a fleeting, hopeful moment, she thought her words had reached them. Then Silas stepped up to the podium, a smug look etched on his face. "A lovely story," he said to the crowd, his voice dripping with condescension. "A testament to her grandfather's vision. But a story is all it is." He then held up a document of his own, a land grant, he called it, dated a year after her family's treaty. With this, he claimed the old pact was nullified. In a single cruel stroke, he twisted her grandfather's honor into the setup for a lie. He painted her father as a swindler who knew about the original pact but chose to hide it, cheating the very people he had promised to protect. The paper Silas held felt fundamentally wrong to her. It looked too new, too pristine to be authentic. But in that charged room, his story was simpler, more convenient. It was the one they wanted to believe. The true horror of the night wasn't Silas, nor the crude forgery he presented as truth. The deepest wound was inflicted by the sight of her own son, Leo, standing steadfastly by Silas's side, nodding in solemn agreement. The judgment radiating from his eyes struck her with the force of a physical blow. His anger had clearly festered beyond the mere loss of an inheritance. It had curdled into a profound and chilling disgust. In his mind, she had not only lost her sanity, but had willfully dragged their family name through the mud, all to honor a bizarre pact with strangers over the sacred legacy of his own grandfather. The moment she saw him mouth the words, "I told you so," to Silas, her world collapsed. In that single, searing instant, everything she thought she had left was annihilated. Her name, her father's legacy, her son, the ranch, the very identity she had guarded so fiercely for 3 decades, simply crumbled into dust. She drove back to the house in a profound daze. The familiar silence of the estate, once a source of comfort, now screamed with the deafening sound of her own failure. She had become a ghost in her own life, a spectral figure left to haunt the ruins of a history she no longer even understood. Back in the silence of the ranch, she hit the bottom. It was a feeling of having nowhere left to fall, a strange and stark clarity that only comes at the absolute lowest point. The quiet was no longer a comfort, it had become an accusation. Every tick of the clock in the hall seemed to echo with her son's disgust and the town's harsh judgment. For a time, she simply sat there in her father's dusty leather chair, letting the crushing weight of failure wash over her in waves. But then, her gaze fell upon the strongbox, still open on the floor where it had been left. The letters were still inside. She had read them once before, desperately searching for the father she wanted to remember, for a hero. That man, however, was an illusion, buried deep beneath the mountain of Silas Croft's lies. In that moment of desolation, a new resolve formed. She made a choice. She reached down and picked up the brittle pages again. This time, however, she would not read them as a grieving daughter. She would read them as a detective, a relentless investigator searching for the unvarnished truth of her own heart, regardless of the cost. She had finally understood a profound truth. It is only when you are at the bottom of the well that you can truly see the sky. Under the solitary glow of a lamplight that seemed to hold its breath with her, she spent the night immersed in the past. The letters, brittle with age, were spread before her, each one a testament to a life she thought she knew. One by one, she let her father's familiar, elegant script guide her through a narrative she had never been ready to hear, a story that dismantled the very foundations of her world. As dawn threatened the horizon, the devastating, simple truth finally unfurled in the quiet room. Her father, the man she had mythologized as a quiet, stoic hero, the silent victim of some grand, unspoken betrayal, was not the victim at all. The image shattered, leaving behind a far more complex and painful reality. He was the source of the rupture. He was the reason for the silence that had haunted their family for decades. Through his own carefully chosen words, he confessed everything. He had known about her grandfather's treaty all along, the pact that should have ensured peace and prosperity for all. The letters painted a vivid picture of a young man caught in an impossible position, describing the suffocating pressure from the town's founding families. Men like Silas Croft's grandfather, powerful and unyielding, had cornered him, convincing him that the town's expansion depended on securing the water rights for themselves, no matter the cost. He wrote of the dark, deliberate choice he made in a moment of weakness and ambition, to hide the pact, to break the sacred promise his own father had made. He had traded integrity for influence, sacrificing a legacy of honor for a precarious seat at their table. His entire existence was suddenly recontextualized. His lifelong emotional distance, the frustrating silence she had always misinterpreted as strength or sorrow, was revealed to be nothing more than profound, crippling shame. It was a deep, corrosive acid that had relentlessly eaten away at him from the inside, leaving behind a hollowed-out man, a ghost in his own home. He had become someone who couldn't bear the weight of his own secrets, so much so that he could no longer look his own daughter in the eye for fear she would see the truth he hid there. He hadn't abandoned her out of malice or a lack of affection. He had retreated from a version of himself he couldn't stand, from a truth he simply could not live with. In an instant, the murky waters of his past receded, leaving behind a moment of stark, painful clarity. He saw then that the antagonist he had spent a lifetime fighting was not the magnate Silas Croft, nor was it the spectral memory of an absent father who had left a void in his life. The true enemy, the architect of his misery, had been the narrative he'd spun for himself, a carefully constructed tale to give meaning to the relentless ache of abandonment. It was his own pride, a towering fortress of loneliness built from the stones of resentment and the mortar of self-pity, and he had been its willing prisoner. And now, resting in his hands, was the proof. The thin, brittle pages of the letters felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the sins of two families. They were more than a confession. They were a weapon forged in betrayal, capable of dismantling an entire legacy. The path to vengeance unfolded in his mind with intoxicating clarity. He could march into the next town meeting, stand before the community, and read the words aloud. He could expose Silas and the esteemed Croft clan, revealing to all that their unimpeachable heritage, the very foundation upon which the town of redemption was built, was nothing but a grand lie, a deception his own father had helped orchestrate. The thought was a rush of power, a heady promise of retribution. He could have his revenge. He could watch the self-righteous masks fall from their faces, see their pride burn to the ground in a glorious cleansing fire that would consume all the hurt he had carried for so long. For a moment, the vision was all-consuming, a wildfire of vindication. But as his eyes drifted past the letters to the world outside his window, the fantasy dissolved. He looked out at the dry, cracked riverbed, a gaping wound in the earth that mirrored the one in his own heart. He understood then that burning another bridge, however gratifying in the moment, would not command the rains to fall or bring the water back to the parched land. A fire born of vengeance would not heal or restore. It would only spread, leaving everyone, guilty and innocent alike, to choke on the bitter, inescapable ashes. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the arid landscape in soft shades of rose and gold. In the stillness, the quiet hum of the caravan's generators was a familiar, almost comforting sound. But as the sun's warmth began to touch the dusty ground, a new sound intruded upon the morning's peace. It was a low, mechanical growl, a vibration felt as much as heard, deeper and far more relentless than any engine she knew. Drawn by the disturbance, she moved to the small window of her trailer, her breath fogging the cool glass for a moment. Her gaze followed the sound down to the wide, dry riverbed that snaked through the valley. And there they were. A line of monstrous yellow machines, bulldozers and excavators, crawled over the stones like grotesque insects. The first construction crews for the dam, Silas's dam, were already at work. For months it had been a distant threat, a rumor carried on the wind, a politician's promise in a far-off town. Now, the reality of it stood starkly against the sunrise. It was happening. She watched them, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. They were preparing to pour tons of concrete over the last vestiges of a shared history, to permanently entomb the memories and the mistakes held within that riverbed. They were about to seal the rupture her own father had created all those years ago, burying it forever under a monument to Silas's ambition. Seeing the raw, indifferent power of those machines stripped away all illusion. The choice before her became brutally simple, stark and real. This was no longer a ghost story, a battle against the shadows of the past. This was about the future, a future that was being paved over before her very eyes. The time for deliberation, for nursing old wounds, was over. She was out of time. In the face of that implacable yellow machinery, the thirst for revenge that had sustained her for so long suddenly felt petty, a small and bitter thing. What good would it do to simply burn down Silas's legacy, to expose his secrets and watch his world crumble? It would be a fleeting satisfaction, leaving behind only ashes and an even deeper emptiness. Destruction was easy. It solved nothing. She couldn't just erase what he was building. She had to build something new, something better in its place. A legacy to counter a legacy. Her eyes, clear now with a purpose she hadn't felt in years, fell upon the worn leather satchel on her table. Inside were the letters. For weeks she had seen them as a weapon, a final, desperate shot in a long-lost war. She reached for them now, her fingers closing around the stack of brittle paper, but their weight felt different in her hand. They were not a weapon anymore, they were tools. They were the foundation. A plan, sharp and fully formed, solidified in her mind as she turned from the window, leaving the menacing view behind. With the satchel in hand, she walked to the door and stepped out into the morning air. The ground beneath her felt solid, the dust settling around her worn boots. For the first time in a life spent on shifting sands, both literal and metaphorical, her feet felt steady, planted, ready to walk a new path. She walked down the long, sloping path toward the riverbed, where everyone was already assembled like actors waiting for their cue on a stage. On one side, Taza and his people stood observing with an incredible, unnerving patience. On the opposite bank stood Silas, arms crossed, flanked by a few men from the town council and the foreman of the construction crew. Caught in the middle of the tense tableau, looking both lost and angry, was her son, Leo. The engines of the bulldozers idled nearby, their low, constant hum adding a palpable vibration to the tense air. When they saw her approaching, a sudden silence fell over the group. A smug look settled on Silas's face, as if he were expecting her to start screaming, to make a scene that would confirm his own narrative. Leo refused to even meet her gaze, his jaw set in defiance. Taza just watched, his expression completely unreadable. She could feel the weight of all their expectations, their silent judgments pressing in on her from every side. They all thought they knew exactly how this story was going to end. She positioned herself in the space between them all, the brittle letters held loosely in her hand. Her gaze swept over Silas, then Taza, before finally resting on her son. "You're all expecting a fight," she announced, her voice clearer and steadier than she had anticipated. "You think I came here to use these letters to prove my father was wronged and that Silas's family are liars." She saw a flicker of fear in Silas's eyes at her words. Yet she made no move to brandish the papers, letting them hang innocuously at her side. "The truth is," she confessed, her tone softening, "my father wasn't wronged. He made a wrong choice. He broke a promise because he was afraid of being an outsider. He hid the truth in a box and lived his whole life in the shadow of that shame." Turning to Leo, she found him meeting her gaze for the first time. In that look, she believed he finally saw her not as a stubborn fortress, but as a woman asking for grace. "And I did the same thing," she admitted, her voice cracking just a little with the weight of her confession. "I built my own fortress of silence. I'm so sorry, Leo, for the years of emotional absence, for passing that wound on to you." In the charged, heavy silence that had fallen over the riverbed, he finally broke the tension with his proposition. He made it clear he hadn't come to wage a legal war over the dam, nor to demand that the ancestral land be simply returned. He was there to offer something far more radical, an entirely new beginning, a path away from generations of conflict. His voice was steady, carrying a weight of conviction as he addressed the two men who embodied the opposing sides of this long-standing wound. "This land's story is one of a broken promise," he declared, his gaze deliberately shifting from Taza's deeply lined, weathered face to Silas's tense and now uncertain expression. "But we can write a new chapter, together." The idea he then laid out was audacious in its simplicity and its collaborative spirit. He proposed the creation of a foundation, a revolutionary partnership to be co-managed by his own family and the San Carlos Apache Nation. He explained that the foundation's purpose would not be ownership, the very concept that had caused so much pain, but rather a shared stewardship. Its core mission would be to finally honor the spirit of the old, desecrated treaty. Through this shared entity, they could collaborate on projects of healing and renewal, implementing modern water conservation techniques, restoring the damaged riverbed to its former vitality, and establishing a cultural heritage site that celebrated both histories, weaving them together into a single, resilient narrative instead of allowing one to erase the other. He concluded by stressing that this proposal wasn't about revenge or claiming a victory for one side. It was about building a durable bridge over the very ground that had divided their people for so long. As his words settled in the quiet air, he watched their faces intently, searching for a reaction in the stillness. The effect was immediate and profound. Silas, who had arrived armed with legal threats and smug certainty, was rendered utterly speechless, his carefully constructed composure completely shattered. Beside him, Leo's hard expression softened, the first visible crack appearing in his rigid mask of anger as a dawning understanding finally lit his eyes. But it was Taza, the elder, who gave the most definitive and powerful answer. He simply smiled, a slow, deep, knowing smile that reached into his canyon-wise eyes and offered a single, quiet, profound nod of assent. The silence on the ranch is different now. It is no longer an empty, defensive quiet, but a peaceful silence, the kind filled with unspoken understanding. It is punctuated by the sound of her granddaughter's laughter as she teaches the child how to mix the perfect shade of green to paint the Palo Verde trees. Leo is there, not as an heir awaiting an inheritance, but as a son, helping survey the riverbed for the new restoration project. Taza has become a friend who stops by for coffee, and their conversations turn to the water table instead of dwelling on the past. She understands that they could never truly get back what was lost. That is an impossibility. Instead, from the broken pieces, they have created something entirely new. For her, catharsis was not found in winning a fight, but in the difficult, messy work of forgiveness. It meant forgiving her father for his weakness and Silas for his fear. The most arduous part, however, was forgiving herself for all the years she had spent locked inside the fortress of her own making. A second chance does not erase what happened. It simply proves that it is never too late to plant a new garden.